lesson is about Jesse James, outlaw, robber, former guerrilla fighter, newspaper legend, and one of the most famous names associated with the Wild West. So sit back, get comfortable, and imagine a dark road in Missouri, a lantern glowing in a railway depot, and a story that is quieter, stranger, and more complicated than the legend. Tonight, we're going to speak softly about Jesse James. Jesse Woodson. James was born in Missouri in 1847. He grew up in a border state that became deeply divided before and during the American Civil War. To understand Jesse James, it helps to begin there, because his later outlaw career was shaped by the violence of the borderlands. Missouri was a place of divided loyalties. Union and Confederate sympathies existed close together, sometimes in the same county or even the same family network. During the war, guerrilla conflict in Missouri and neighboring Kansas could be brutal. Raids, reprisals, ambushes, and personal revenge blurred the line between military action and local violence. Jesse's older brother, Frank James, joined Confederate guerrilla fighters. Jesse, while still a teenager, became associated with some of the same violent networks. These groups included men connected to William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson. Their warfare was irregular, personal, and often cruel. This background matters because the popular image of Jesse James as a romantic outlaw can hide where the story begins. It begins not with a clean adventure, but with war, trauma, loyalty, revenge, and a region where violence did not simply stop when the Civil War ended. After the war, Jesse and Frank James became linked with a series of robberies. Banks, trains, and stagecoaches became targets. The James Younger gang, associated with Jesse, Frank, and members of the Younger family, became one of the most famous outlaw groups of the era. The robberies were real crimes. People were threatened, injured, and killed. Money was stolen. Communities were frightened. Families were left with grief. It is important to say this plainly because history becomes less honest when it polishes violence into entertainment. At the same time, Jesse James became a public figure through newspapers. Some writers, especially editor John Newman Edwards, presented Jesse and Frank as Confederate avengers and noble rebels against banks, railroads, and Reconstruction Authority. This was mythmaking in print. Newspapers helped turn Jesse James into a symbol. To some readers, he became a defiant figure resisting a changing world. To others, he was simply a dangerous criminal. Both views existed during his lifetime. The power of the Jesse James story lies partly in that tension. The real person lived in a violent post-war landscape. The legend became larger than the person, shaped by politics, resentment, sensational journalism, and later Western storytelling. One of the gang's most famous disasters came in 1876 in Northfield, Minnesota. The James Younger gang attempted to rob the First National Bank. The raid went badly. Townspeople resisted. Several gang members were killed or captured. The younger brothers were wounded and arrested. Jesse and Frank escaped, but the gang as it had existed was broken. Northfield is a useful moment to pause with, because it shows the difference between legend and reality. In legend, the outlaw rides through danger with perfect control. In reality, plans fail, people resist, confusion spreads, violence turns chaotic. Escape is not glory, it is survival. After Northfield, Jesse James continued with smaller groups. His world became narrower and more suspicious. As law enforcement pressure increased and rewards grew, trust became dangerous. The outlaw life often ends not in open battle, but in betrayal, Jesse James was killed in 1882 by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang, who hoped to collect a reward. Jesse was at home in St. Joseph, Missouri. According to the familiar account, he had removed his guns and stood on a chair to straighten a pitcher when Ford shot him from behind. The death of Jesse James became another part of the legend. The outlaw was dead, but the story kept growing. Songs, dime novels, films, tourist sites, and family stories turned him into a permanent figure in American popular memory. So what should we do with Jesse James now? We can study him as a criminal, as a former Confederate guerrilla, as a product of post-war Missouri, as a media figure, and as a case study in how societies create legends around violence. We do not need to admire him to find the history fascinating. The Wild West itself is often remembered through simplified images: hats, horses, guns, saloons, sheriffs, outlaws, and open country. But the actual 19th century West and borderlands were filled with politics, migration, racial conflict, indigenous dispossession, railroads, capital, newspapers, courts, farms, towns, and memory. Jesse James belongs to that larger world. He was not simply a lone rider outside society. He depended on networks of family, sympathizers, informants, newspapers, and political feeling. His reputation moved ahead of him like a shadow. The train robbery is one of the classic images in Jesse James' stories. A train moves through the dark. A rail is tampered with. Men with guns appear. Passengers are frightened. The safe is opened or forced. The outlaws vanish into the countryside. But behind that image is a world of new technology and new money. Railroads were transforming the United States. They moved people, mail, livestock, grain, manufactured goods, and cash. They also represented corporate power, land speculation, and the reach of modern systems into rural places. This made train robberies symbolically powerful. They seemed to pit horsemen and guns against iron, schedules, and capital. But symbols can mislead. Robbing a train did not make someone a champion of ordinary people. It made passengers and workers vulnerable. The romantic frame was something newspapers and later storytellers added. The same is true of bank robberies. Banks could be unpopular, especially in communities facing debt or political resentment, but a robbery was still an act of coercion. Clerks, customers, and local people were placed in danger. This is why the Jesse James story is useful for Whisper University. It lets us separate atmosphere from admiration. We can imagine the quiet road, the oil lamp, the telegraph wire, the newspaper office, and the courthouse record, while still being honest about harm. There is also the question of memory after death. Why do some criminals become legends, while others are forgotten? Part of the answer is timing. Jesse James lived at a moment when newspapers, railroad expansion, Civil War memory, and frontier myth were all converging. Another part is narrative. The public likes stories with recognizable shapes. The rebel, the chase, the betrayal, the last stand, the outlaw killed by someone close to him. Jesse's life was repeatedly arranged into those shapes, but history is not only story, it is evidence, dates, places, testimonies, newspaper accounts, legal records, graves, letters, and local memory all help us examine the difference between the man and the myth. When we slow the story down, Jesse James becomes less like a hero from a poster and more like a person formed by a violent time, making violent choices, then being transformed into a legend by a culture that often preferred the excitement of the chase to the pain left behind. That is a quieter, more useful lesson. As we close, imagine a Missouri town after sunset. A newspaper lies folded on a desk. A train whistle fades into the distance. Somewhere, a wanted poster curls at the edge. The road outside is dark, and the legend is already beginning to separate from the life. The name Jesse James still echoes, because America has always been fascinated by outlaws. But the whisper underneath the echo is more complicated. War does not end neatly. Violence leaves stories behind, and a legend can sometimes hide the very truth it claims to preserve. There is one more layer to the story, the way the West became a stage. During Jesse James's lifetime, the United States was rapidly changing. Railroads expanded, newspapers reached more readers, photography made faces easier to circulate, telegraph wires moved news quickly. A crime in one town could become a story in another before memory had time to cool. This mattered because reputation could become a kind of second life. A person might commit an act in Missouri, but the version printed in a newspaper could travel farther than the person ever did. Each retelling selected details, sharpened motives, and created a shape readers could recognize. In some accounts, Jesse James became an avenger. In others, he became a monster. In still others, he became a thrilling character in a Western tale. The evidence was often less tidy. Human lives rarely arrange themselves as neatly as legends do. Frank James's later life also shows how strange this history can become. After Jesse's death, Frank surrendered, was tried, and was acquitted. He lived for decades after the outlaw years, giving tours and appearing at events connected to the old legend. The story did not end with the robberies. It became performance, memory, and commerce. This is common in Western history. A violent frontier past becomes a tourist attraction. A criminal life becomes a ballad. A town becomes famous because something terrible happened there. People visit the places, buy postcards, and stand wherever danger once stood. The past becomes quieter, safer, and easier to consume. But the historian's task is to keep listening for the rougher truth underneath. Who was harmed? Who benefited from the story? Which parts were exaggerated? Which parts were forgotten? Why did certain communities want Jesse James remembered as a rebel, while others remembered him as a thief and killer? The answer has to do with the unfinished emotions of the Civil War and Reconstruction. For former Confederates and their sympathizers, Jesse could be imagined as someone who refused defeat. That image ignored his victims, but it gave political feeling a dramatic symbol. Outlaw legend and historical resentment became tangled together. That is why this episode belongs not only to Wild West history, but to memory studies. Jesse James is a reminder that popular history can be shaped by longing. People sometimes prefer a usable legend to an uncomfortable record. If you are half asleep now, you do not need to hold every name and date. Just keep the quiet outline. A young man shaped by border violence, robberies turned into headlines, a gang broken by a failed raid, a death by betrayal, a legend that grew because America was ready to print, sell, sing, and retell it. The pursuit of the James brothers also shows the growth of private law enforcement. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency became involved in trying to capture the gang. Pinkerton agents represented a new kind of organized investigation in a country where local law enforcement often struggled across county and state lines. Their involvement added another layer to the legend. Detectives, informants, safe houses, raids, rumors, and fear. But this too Jesse and Frank James at the James family home resulted in an explosion that killed their young half-brother and injured their mother. The incident deepened sympathy for the James family among some supporters and further fed the politics of resentment. This is how cycles of violence and memory harden. A crime leads to pursuit, pursuit leads to another death. Each side remembers its own wounds most clearly. Over time, the public story becomes not only about law and crime, but about grievance. Jesse James was also a husband and father. That fact does not soften the crimes, but it reminds us that people in history are rarely only one thing. He could be a domestic figure inside one room and a dangerous outlaw outside another. The contradiction is uncomfortable, but history often lives in uncomfortable contradictions. The families of victims had their own stories too. A clerk killed during a robbery, a passenger terrorized on a train, a town forced into panic, a household left grieving. These are quieter than the outlaw legend, but more morally important. Popular culture often follows the rider fleeing into the dark. History should also stay with the people left behind. That is why a whispered lecture can be a good way to tell this story. The slow pace gives us room to resist the easy version. We do not have to cheer the chase. We can listen for the social conditions, the political bitterness, the media machinery, and the human cost beneath the famous name. Jesse James did not create the Wild West myth alone. He was folded into it. The myth needed figures like him, dangerous enough to excite, political enough to symbolize, distant enough to become safe entertainment. By the time films and novels inherited the story, the real 19th century wounds had often been smoothed into scenery. But if we return to the archive, the scenery becomes sharper. The railroad is a business, the bank has employees, the town has families, the outlaw has choices, the war has aftershocks, the legend has authors. Tonight, let the myth grow quiet, let the archive remain, let the lantern dim over the old road. I want to thank you for listening to Whisper University. If you made it all the way to the end, I'm very glad you are here. I hope tonight's quiet lesson helped you relax, learn something new, or simply drift for a little while in a calmer direction. If you enjoyed this whispered lecture, you can support Whisper University by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or leaving a gentle comment with a topic you would like to hear next. It helps this little university grow and helps us keep making the world a little more relaxed and a little more curious through ASMR. Until the next quiet lesson, take care, breathe slowly,